Okay. Well, first of all, I want to welcome everyone to this webinar, Finding Freedom. Today, we'll be talking about Sikh American experiences in immigration, advocacy, policy, and racialization, connecting past and present. My name is Kaur Gill, and I'm the Executive Director of the Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund, SALDEF. We're a national Sikh American advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C., focused on defending civil rights and religious freedom. SALDEF is the oldest Sikh American civil rights organization and will actually be celebrating our 30th anniversary next year. I also served as chair of the Department of Homeland Security's Faith-Based Security Advisory Council, FBSAC, under Secretary Mayorkas, where I provided recommendations to DHS on how to work with faith-based communities, advocated for religious accommodations for detainees with ICE and CBP, and pushed for a firewall between agencies between DHS, FEMA, and ICE, as well as provided recommendations on how to address transnational repression. That was definitely a different time than what we are living in right now, and I'm sure we'll get to that in the course of this conversation. But I am so excited to introduce my co-conversationalist and colleague, Amrit Deol. And Amrit, I will pass it over to you to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. A special thank you to the Sikh Foundation and for all involved who brought us here together to have this critical conversation. Thank you, the need for organizing this, for getting us here into this space together. Thank you to the participants who are choosing to spend their Friday this way with us. I am very excited to have this conversation with you all and looking forward to kind of having your input during the Q&A session. My name is Amrit Deol. I am an assistant professor here at Fresno State University in Central California. I specialize in histories of diaspora, in histories of labor, race, religion in the American West, Punjab, and more globally in the early 1900s. Specifically, I focus on writing about empire and literature in my current book project, which is entitled Mutiny on the Move, Migrant Workers, Anti-Colonial Literature, and the Fight for Freedom. So that's what I do in my research side. In terms of community work and outside of academics, I'm also a board member of the Sikh American History Project, which is dedicated to preserving, promoting, unearthing, and uncovering Sikh American histories and being able to connect these histories to the general public, to academics, to scholars, to students in an accessible way. I'm really excited to be here and I'm happy to talk more about that if folks are interested. I'm happy to be here in conversation with you, Kiran. I'm appreciative that you are my conversation partner. But yeah, that's a bit about myself.
Wonderful. Thank you. And if you could also share what inspired you to get into this work. I know you personally, but I think your story is really, really interesting. So if you could just share maybe just for our, the attendees here to give a little bit of background about how you entered into this space.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I am Sikh American myself. I was born and raised in the Imperial Valley, which is down south in Southern California, just along the border of US and Mexico. It currently hosts, and it has in the past, a very vibrant Punjabi Sikh community. And though the numbers have gone down since then due to migration and people kind of shifting elsewhere, it has a very prominent history in Sikh American history. After that, I moved to the Central Valley and have been within California since, kind of in different parts. And so I've had multitudes of the Sikh American experience myself. And I think my journey towards wanting to kind of work with the community and really uncover who my community is and all of its diversity and all that it entails comes from my own childhood, probably what as it does for a lot of folks. I grew up in Imperial Valley, like I said, and when my brother and I were quite young, we grew up on a farm with my parents, and there was actually this safe that an early Sikh immigrant had left And in that safe, my brother and I decided one summer when we were like 10 or 12 that we're going to break it open and find all this treasure. And so we did that for one whole summer. My parents were very happy. We were very occupied. They didn't have to worry about us. And we found all these documents that pertain to an early Sikh immigrant experience. And that was deeply connected to the Gadar Party. And so that really inspired me to kind of deep dive further. And it took me down this path in history and probably informs why I choose to do the things that I do today. And so that's what kind of brings me to this conversation. But I would love to know, Kiran, what got you involved in advocacy, in immigration and policy as it pertains to the Sikh American community.
Yeah, and thank you, Amrit. And I think similar to you, it's very personal to me. It comes from my own personal journey and personal story. I grew up, I moved around quite a bit growing up, but we were always very close and tied to the local Sikh American community, to my local Sangat. So that experience is very much shapes who I am, and I think defines my values, defines where I choose to place my time and my energy. And I think for me, it was just really helpful in building self-confidence and self-esteem. On the flip side, because we moved around so much, I don't think I put it in these terms, but at that age, but I could also see that we, as Sikhs, were seen as perpetual foreigners. I think it was tough in terms of really thinking about how we belonged in this country, and being new to a place is one thing, but also trying to figure out, navigate the immigrant experience and being new to a place. I think that has its own complexities, additional complexities. I actually went to college at NYU, and I was there during 9/11. We were living in New Jersey at the time, and seeing the backlash against our community, seeing how we were otherized in a way I had never seen in my lifetime, I think that really affected me and the way I chose to proceed in my work. When I came back to New Jersey, after graduating from college, I got very involved in local politics and interfaith initiatives. And that's where I found my way to SELDF. I saw the work that they were doing in our community. I saw some really, really horrible cases of discrimination and bullying in my local Sangha from external parties. And I think that is something where I really saw the value in organizations like SELDF, and I'm glad to be here today. Awesome. Um, I'll start with the first question. From your perspective, what are some of the key moments or experiences in early Sikh American history that continue to shape the community today?
It's a really good question. As a historian, I'm going to try not to be too chatty about it because I think I deep dive and I tend to bore my students. So I'm not going to be that person today. But I like to think about these sort of early moments of Sikh American history as being split into two, right? I think there's the processes of racialization that our community has gone through that we're kind of still dealing with a lot of the long-term impacts of those. And then there's also the solidarity efforts that come from within the community that I think are still efforts that we continue to find fruitful, and we rely on those today. So in terms of processes of racialization is actually the process through which we apply meaning to a given race. There's the classification that happens as someone is Asian or African American or Indigenous and American Indian. So there's all these categories that we ascribe to folks now that are legible in our census. But in terms of applying meaning to those categories that inform our actual policy, that is the process of racialization. And there's different moments where we've kind of seen this happen to South Asian people more broadly, but then also Sikh people more specifically here in the United States. For instance, the anti-Oriental riots that take place in Bellingham and across the border in Vancouver as well around the same time. There's a lot of anti-South Asian and by extension, anti-Sikh rhetoric that takes place within households, within labor unions, within church spaces, within a political discourse that really fuels this drive of racial violence that takes place in those specific moments, but then all these subsequent acts of violence that occur in the Pacific Northwest afterwards. Now, those are acts of violence that we can look at individually, but that sentiment that's created through these processes help inform some of our policies. For example, afterwards, after the anti-Oriental riots, there's a massive campaign to bar immigration of folks from South Asia, and we start to see stricter deportation practices. We start to see limited immigration in terms of who's allowed. We see the landmark Bhagat Singh Thind decision in the Supreme Court, which denies access to citizenship for Sikh people in 1923. And we have examples of this in a more contemporary moment as well with 9/11 and what you've talked about. We can delve into more in detail of what the impact is of those practices of racialization, of applying meaning like stereotypes that categorize us as sort of villains in that narrative, right? Um, we see it in the 2016 election. We see it now, right, in some of the discourse that's continuing to creep up. So I think those examples of racialization are quite critical in understanding how the public and the social can inform our policy. But I think as someone who's trying to be positive throughout this as well, is that there's other moments in our past that we also still see consequences of in a positive way. So our community has shown strength and an ability to bind together throughout all these moments that I think are still informing our experience, like talking about different types of oppression and exploitation and forming the Gullah Party in Oregon, and using that as a driving factor to kind of seek freedom and independence. I think the establishment and wanting community and the creation of the Stockton Gurdwara, which is still bearing so much fruit today for our community. It's a space that we constantly look back to as inspiration. Um, I think about political leaders that emerged during that time, like the Leap Sing Song, who was really informed by those experiences that I discussed of racialization. So for me, there's all these different critical moments in Sikh American history that we can still learn from, whether it's the positive or the negative. But there's a lot to look back to.
Yeah, that's interesting. And as you were talking, I actually didn't think of this earlier when we were kind of going through some of the question and prep for this, but it's interesting because I think that informed sort of the enthusiasm and um, the energy around Zora Mamdani's campaign, right? The racialization and even with other communities, how immigrants are currently perceived, the xenophobia, the ways that we have really been buried under these systems of oppression. They haven't really been named. They haven't really been certainly addressed or even acknowledged by this administration, as we've seen the rollback of so many different initiatives, um, the way that they've talked about DEI, the way that generally immigrants are seen as not a positive benefit to our country. And I think we've seen recently with the case of Harjinder Singh, um, who was involved in the tragic crash, which cost 3 lives in Florida, how that was really looked through the lens of xenophobia and through this really political football of the immigration issue in this country from the conservative perspective, really sort of casting that on all the immigrant communities and particularly Sikhs and Punjabi truckers. And we've seen the ramifications of that. Earlier this year, we saw the EO for English proficiency, which provided the administration, I guess, reason to go and to stop and or some could say harass truckers. We know that from reports that has been much more prevalent with Black and Brown communities where folks are stopped and questioned, and in some cases, if they don't have appropriate paperwork, detained. And so I think we've seen this through line from what you're saying of racialization over the course of our history, but it's also really good to hear about the times where our community has banded together. And I think we are really in an interesting moment right now from what we're seeing, where people are looking to band together. And I just had actually a great conversation with an interfaith group yesterday about how they felt compelled to really stand up for the congregants in their community that were subject to detention and potential deportation, and ways that we can work together across faith groups. So I think it's in this moment we really have to be creative, and it's great to hear those examples of the past. Um, I know also Sikh migrants historically faced detention at Angel Island and other ports. How do those experiences inform our understanding of detention practices today?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. And I also appreciate you being able to kind of ground us in the present as well. As a historian, I spend too much time in the past, and I think it's great to be able to kind of see where we have diverged, where we have connections, where we can learn from. So I'm so appreciative of the work that you're doing as well and the conversations that you're having. And it's very critical and helps us better understand how we can look towards the past, right? In terms of Angel Island, there's, we look towards Angel Island just because it has such a deep history around deportation and detention, and interrogation of sort of new arrivals and also not so new arrivals to the country. Um, the early roots of Angel Island, Ellis Island is very popular, but Angel Island is very much rooted in anti-Asian sentiment and rhetoric. In fact, it was created around the time of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which barred Chinese laborers from coming to the United States. And so there's a deep history there of anti-Asian sentiment that informed the practices at Angel Island that South Asians and Sikh people more specifically kind of went through as sort of a after effect, right? And that's their point of entry. And so that's kind of the sentiment that they're subjected to. And oftentimes, when we look back to Sikh American history, we're kind of looking at it as a silo, but it's much more informative to kind of see what is more broadly happening to folks that are coming in from these different parts of Asia. Um, but Angel Island is no different than a lot of our early sort of immigration and restrictive immigration practices and institutions. Like, for instance, the early versions of the Border Patrol in the early 1900s are also used and centered around keeping out Asian immigrants, because of the Page Act in 1875, which restricted Chinese women, or the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which restricted Chinese men, and then also subsequently all of the immigration acts that come afterwards, or the gentleman's agreement that comes afterwards, and all of these sort of different policies that restrict Asian immigration, have these deep roots in anti-Asian sentiment. Now, specifically for the Sikh experience, there's very specific things that set this community apart. I think for about 1910 to 1940, around 8,000 South Asians came through Angel Island, primarily many of them Sikh. They received the largest rejection rate, around half. And usually disease was at the center of why that rejection happened. Folks were challenged with having hookworm, and then sent back. Usually that became cause for deportation. So Ellis Island is a space that people kind of think about as a welcoming place for immigrants, and Angel Island is often considered to be the place where you go to be sent back, right? And South Asians kind of received an extensive brunt of that sentiment. Um, Now, many did have hookworm, but it's part of this process, like I mentioned, of racialization, which categorizes them in a very specific way and creates a stereotype, which fuels more anti-Sikh sentiment, right? So the disease aspect of it really pushed this narrative forward of Sikh men being considered dirty, lazy, diseased, and essentially just unwanted, right? And so that starts to also inform a lot of the policy that comes after that. So Angel Island is a space of detention, interrogation, rejection, but there's all these other echoing policies that are coming up and practices at the time as well, that are anti-immigrant in nature. For instance, now we hear about ICE raids. Raids were also quite common then too. These immigration agents would often raid labor camps specifically where a lot of Asian workers worked, to be able to go verify documentation. And oftentimes, people might not have it on their person, and that would be a cause for deportation and detainment. There's also surveillance, right? That would be done. We're quite familiar with that history with the Governor Party. So a lot of the tactics that we're seeing institutionalized now through ICE and other institutions and organizations, have a strong history and legacy, unfortunately, in the way that Asian and South Asian and Sikh immigrants were treated in the past. So there's a lot to, I think, look to in Sikh experience at Angel Island that can help inform where those practices are coming from today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I feel like in many ways, from what you described, our community and the Asian American community broadly was essentially a guinea pig for a lot of what we're seeing today. And, what are we seeing today? We're seeing ICE is doubling its detention capacity. Like DHS is the most funded government agency. Um, we've see that we see an increasing number of Sikhs detained by ICE, but we're certainly not alone in that category. And we've seen SALDEF has certainly seen both with legal and undocumented. So we've seen folks with legal status that we have helped to get out of detention, and we've seen folks that are undocumented. And I know we're going to be talking a little bit about the word undocumented and what it means, has meant historically, and what it means today. And that's why I think it's so incredibly important that people know their rights. But what is interesting from what you were sharing earlier, what occurred to me, and I'm curious from your perspective, because I think about sort of the 2016 you know, sort of phrasing that Trump went viral for about calling Mexicans criminals and rapists. And I think about sort of the recent conversations about H-1B and, you know, um, immigrants taking our jobs and Indians taking our jobs, South Asians. I'm curious if you think the rhetoric, is it echoing from the past? Is it more bold? Or do you think it's sort of been consistent?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I think it is echoing of a past. I think um, I think the medium through which we hear it changes, right? Oftentimes, the same sort of rhetoric of they're taking our jobs, they're lowering wages, or it's disrupting our social fabric. These sort of conversations, or kind of vilifying immigrant men and women as being sort of like invaders in this country is rhetoric that's very, very old, an anti-immigrant rhetoric that's very, very old and has been associated with Sikh people and more broadly just immigrant communities for a very long time. I think it could be jarring to hear regardless of what era you're looking into. It's unfortunate that it's kind of picking up. And, to an extreme sense, when you kind of look back and you study some of the rhetoric that was used to justify a lot of the exclusionary policies or discriminatory policies, let's say over 100 years ago, the rhetoric is very eerily close to the rhetoric that's used today. Using campaigns, saying keep them out, or like I think San Francisco even had a campaign that was anti-Asian, that was keep San Francisco white. That there's sort of eerie echoes from the contemporary moment that we can kind of look to in the past and hear and see. It doesn't make it any easier to kind of know that a lot of the dialogue and a lot of the rhetoric is the same. But I think what we can look back to is how people have effectively navigated those conversations and spaces, right? Um, but yeah, it is very, very similar, which is, of course, upsetting. The medium shift, usually we had these conversations of anti-immigrant rhetoric being displayed at labor unions, in public spaces, in churches, and in homes, over the radio, in newspapers, political cartoons. Now we have things like social media, we have, Twitter, X, and things like that. The medium has shifted, but a lot of the rhetoric is absolutely the same.
That's interesting because something that comes to mind is in current like conversation, right? Is we hear a lot about replacement theory. And, of thinking about the number of immigrants, particularly Sikh immigrants that we see at the turn of the 1900s. I mean, it wasn't really in numbers that you would think that it could really fundamentally shift the demographics of this country. And it seems like that has come up as a concern, certainly over the last couple election cycles, whether it's sort of in the background or in some cases, depending on who it is, overtly stated. Um, was that a concern back then as well? It seems like maybe it was, but obviously irrational throughout, but particularly when there's really not a sizable number of um, of immigrants, and particularly Sikh immigrants or Asian immigrants in this country.
Absolutely. It has been a concern. I think that's why we have a lot of that early sort of rhetoric associated with Sikh people as being coming in hordes. Hordes is a very big word. Or sort of flooding the country is also another big word that's used. A lot of early immigrants were described as diseases or as a virus, right? That might kind of like permeate all facets of society. And then I think invasion is also a very big term that's used at the time. It's a very common concern, I think, for immigrants that are coming in, immigrant groups. It's not rooted in reality or rationality, but I think it is a rhetoric that can be picked up at a given time. What we also see historically is that as immigration rates might increase over time, we also see anti-X sentiment also increase over time, right? So, in the 70s, after Vietnam War, we also 70s and 80s, we see a rise in our refugee population coming in from Southeast Asia. We also see in the 80s a rise in anti-Asian violence, right? So, we see a lot of sentiment coming up and a lot of hate crimes happening in that era as well. And so, we can kind of anticipate some of these patterns, unfortunately, because they've just happened so often.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's that's unfortunate, but I think we're seeing those realities play out right now. Yeah, no, um I was going to move on to the next question, but I actually did have just a quick question if you can answer it. I'm curious your thoughts as a historian on the sort of selective history used to underpin some of these arguments. Do you what what would you recommend for folks, as some of these tropes about immigrants coming in as invaders, hordes, they seem like they are actually pulling from an even like a colonialist history, and even maybe farther back than that. I'm just curious, before we move on to the next question, if you could just share a couple of quick thoughts on that, and selective history to underpin some of this ideology.
Yeah, it's a very old fear. I think it comes out of a lot of that sort of early colonial era. Absolutely, it's a very early divide of this like East versus West rhetoric that because a lot of the invasion rhetoric is ascribed to folks that are coming in from quote unquote the East, right? And like with my students, we usually pull up a world map and we say what is the East versus the West, and they start listing out countries. And after a while, they realize that it's not just a neat line in the middle of the world, but instead it's a bit all over the place. And they're like, well, if it's East versus West, why not just draw the line in the middle and be done with it? Because it's not really a divide of our geography. It's a divide of ideology and also an understanding of our civilizations in the West are inherently different than civilizations in the East. And there's no way that the East can kind of meet the West. And so as we have more colonialism expanding in from the West into the East, like in spaces like India or East Asia or the Middle East, there's these interactions that people are having in different cultures for the first time. And so a lot of those interactions take place in the East. But as we're having more immigrants in a very interesting way being asked to come to the US to serve in some kind of industry, whether that's railways or whether that's expansions of industrialism or whether that's, our sugar industry in the Hawaiian Islands, we are asking for immigrants to come in and work in those industries. But there's also a fear that there's going to be this sort of opposite colonialism happening in this space now, and the anxiety is kind of underlining, and it speaks to that anti-immigrant narrative that's unfortunately carried on for so long. So I think there's as a historian, I like to think that multiple things can be true at the same time, that you can invite a certain set of immigrants to come in to fill your labor gap, right? But you can also not want them to be here and be scared of them as well. So unfortunately, both of those things are true. And what ends up happening is a lot of these immigrant groups are bearing the brunt of resentment that they didn't have any place in, and they didn't create themselves a situation, right?
Yeah, no, that's interesting because it's the same group that will sort of tout the virtues and the benefits of colonialism, does not want to be colonized itself. It's just It's just interesting. Not that that's what's happening, but that's obviously, part of the fear, and what they're, messaging out. But yeah, no, thank you for that. I appreciate that because that's something that's been on my mind as well. Um, the next question I have for you is how have Sikh Americans historically navigated questions of citizenship? And how do contemporary debates about birthright citizenship resonate with those earlier challenges?
I think for that question, I have a question for you now in turn, just because I think the birthright citizenship has come into such a sort of spotlight over, well, over this year. That feels like a very long year. But I would love to hear kind of like what are the concerns now, and then maybe I can kind of connect them to the past, right? So kind of moving backwards in that way. Yeah.
Absolutely. And this is still going through the courts, but as you may be aware, on January 20th, 2025, Trump signed Executive Order 1416 titled Protecting the Meaning and Value of American Citizenship. And basically, this EO was sought to reinterpret the 14th Amendment Citizenship Clause. So basically, not to say that not all children born in the US automatically become citizens. So it specifically targets children born to parents who are undocumented immigrants and immigrants who are here in the US temporarily. And so what we've heard from the Trump administration, their rationale, and I guess supporters of this, is basically they're arguing that birthright citizenship incentivizes illegal immigration or birth tourism. So they're claiming that there's immigrants that come here, they are pregnant, they are basically just coming here to have their children here on American soil so that they can take advantage of our laws, which would allow their child then to become an American citizen. But if you can see the examples they use are typically Asian examples. So they'll cite, um, Chinese individuals coming, Chinese women or South Asian women. So again, we can see that racialization through line through this debate as well. And then some basically argue that the 14th Amendment was really explicitly states that if you're born here, you're a US citizen, was originally intended to protect newly freed enslaved people and not everyone born here, which it was a case that has legal precedent in the Wong Kim Ark case, which again plainly states the decision there was that anyone born here, including immigrants, if they have a child here, that individual, if they're born on U.S. soil, they are a citizen. So again, the against is pretty clear. We have legal precedent. It is in the 14th Amendment. There's also concerns, obviously, if you have people that are born here and they're not US citizens, they could essentially be stateless. Um, and really just that this is deeply this idea of who can become a citizen, who is a citizen, is something that's deeply rooted in the principle of American law and society. And this is who we are fundamentally as Americans. So I think it shifts the definition of who is American and who can be American. And I think that's part of what we're talking about here. So yeah, I'd love to hear, your thoughts on how this is, I guess, echoes what we've seen in the past.
Yeah, I appreciate that because it seems like it's such a there's a lot of chaos around this and there's a lot of confusion around it as well. So I appreciate you kind of being able to kind of tease that out, especially in a time where it's very difficult to kind of see one end from another. And so it's a complicated subject, right? Which has a lot of discourse around it. Um, but the questions around citizenship were huge for early Sikh American history. And we a lot of our population, not a lot of our population, our whole population of Sikh people from Punjab coming to the US arrived here in a very ambiguous category, right? We didn't really have clear racial delineations of what we were. There's not really clear classification of who we are in terms of our ancestry, which helps us neatly fit into a certain category. And so a lot of the early arrivals were just termed Hindu in legal discourse. That was it. And Hindu could have been a misnomer. It could have been out of ignorance. It could have been an echo to the term Hindustan and Hindustani. Obviously it's wrong in just the case of Sikh people anyways, which is very interesting. we can talk more about that. But it has legal consequences, that term Hindu does, right? Because as people apply for citizenship, the policy at the time dictated that the only people who could have citizenship were free Black persons and free white persons of good moral standing. And so there's two very distinct categories racially that get citizenship, and all of the political, social, economic rights that come with citizenship, right? Which is a whole bucket load of stuff, right? And so we have several individuals, a few dozen, that go up for citizenship who are of Punjabi Sikh descent, and make this argument that I'm high caste, so I have ancestry that is associated with Caucasians. I am Americanized, I speak English and this and that. They go to their local courts, they apply for citizenship, and they do get it. Dozens of them do. Um, until Bhagat Singh Thind, of course, goes up and is denied again. There's an immigration officer that follows him every time he presents his case and argues against him, which is very interesting because this is the peak in the 1920s, early 1920s, of anti-Sikh sentiment. And so the case goes to the Supreme Court. It is presented to Justice Sutherland, who states that he is not going to grant citizenship to Thind, because he, according to common sense and according to a common American man, does not look white, right? And so the argument is made that you need to be physically presented as white in terms of skin tone and not just ancestry claims, right? And so in that case, of course, Thind doesn't get citizenship, but then everyone else who did get citizenship, those dozens of people who bought businesses or homes or settled down, have their rights revoked and are essentially stateless, right? In just the reading of that verdict. And so, of course, that can be a lot of upheaval in an individual's life. You have renounced Indian citizenship, so you don't have that either. You might be someone who's a sort of a political refugee for your anti-colonial practices, so you're trying to seek refuge, which you no longer have. And so there's a reliance then on birthright citizenship, right? And I know you mentioned the critical case that came out for the Wong Kim Ark case that really solidified that birthright citizenship is a real thing. So our community relied very heavily on birthright citizenship to access the ability to settle here, to have children and put farms and homes and businesses in their kids' names, to settle down roots. And so there's a very long lasting legacy of trying to be able to find some way to make grounding here, right? And so citizenship has always been contentious for our community and for others as well. It's been ambiguous in our case, in our community, right? We didn't turn Asian until 1923. So we're kind of newly added into the group. But the consequences of that are very big, right? And so it's interesting to kind of hear that those terms are still being debated today.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and what it makes me think of really is that, sort of liberation require for all of us requires for us to be in solidarity with one another, and it can't just be, one community, and this idea of, you mentioned that there was some cases where individuals sort of said that they were Caucasian, and I know that was also part of the Bhagat Singh Thind case, right? So that sort of claiming that proximity to whiteness doesn't necessarily offer the security that people think it does. And it really, over the long term, it is something that can ebb and flow depending on the political winds. So really, it's about collective liberation for all of us. And I think that's where we see true security for our communities, I would say. Yeah. But thank you for that, Amrit. Um, I'm also curious because I think it's important we cover this. So, um, legally and socially, how is the term immigrant defined? I know we've used that a lot in this conversation. And also, what distinguishes documented from undocumented immigration? And what do these categories mean in practice? So, if you could give us from a historical perspective, and then I'm happy to chime in from what we're seeing today.
Yeah, that's so just to kind of before I kind of dive into some of the definitions, it's really important to kind of understand that these categories are very fluid. They change over time. They are informed by whatever context they're in. For instance, in 1923, you could have said you're white and get citizenship as a Punjabi Sikh person, and after that, you can't. So obviously, these things change over time, and I think it's a better and more informative way to look into the past if we start from that place. In terms of how immigrant has been defined in the past, and I'm curious to see how it is today, but it's really about a group or a person who is trying to come to the US through some process, right? Through some sort of legal process to be recognized as someone who has intentions of settling here, right? And so that can take various and different forms, but I think as we've kind of heard and talked about already in our conversation, and I'm sure we'll dive more into in the Q&A, that everyone's different groups kind of go through these processes in a different way and are read in a different way. But oftentimes, immigrant can be conflated with foreigner, right? So legally, it's about someone who's going through a legal process to attain rights to settle here, right? Um, but socially, that's when things can get a little bit messy as well in terms of how are we describing immigrants. They are not foreigners. They are not perpetual foreigners and they are not invaders, right? They're going through a process that is in place and is legal. So, similarly, with terms like documented and undocumented, these are individuals on both sides that are going through an actual process that allows them to be here. For instance, the refugee crisis is very similar, right? Of like, we can't let them in. But as a country, we are legally obligated to listen to the case of every person who is applying for asylum. They have the legal right to ask for asylum. By asking for asylum, you are not committing a crime, right? And so I think criminality, as it's being associated with immigrant, with documentation, with those that are undocumented, that's where things get very messy, right? And so that's kind of historically, we just kind of see those terms shift all the time, but we see perceptions of it really, really challenging, right? And those can be big hurdles in how people actually read these terms and what they think they mean.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think we've seen that, in cases today, right? And I think particularly in this current political climate, we've seen both the term immigrant and particularly undocumented really, for many people, equate to criminality. There's something that fundamentally particularly with the undocumented, like being undocumented means someone has committed a criminal act, has basically chosen to ignore the different ways someone can seek to become uh, go on the become or start on the pathway to citizenship or to legal residency in the U.S. And I think that is very concerning, and I think that's part of where you're seeing um, right now with certain groups' reaction to the way that ICE is doing immigration enforcement, right? I mean, some people really bought into this idea that ICE was going to go after criminals and transnational gangs, and that was really the focus of the enforcement. But essentially, if you say anyone who is undocumented, even if they've come to this country and gone to a port of entry and are seeking asylum and go through all the processes and are meeting with ICE regularly and sort of checking the box on every single part of that process, those individuals are still being detained. Those individuals are being pulled out from communities and um, detained and deported. In some cases, not even to their home country, right? That's part of the cruelty of this current administration. And the other thing that we're seeing with this administration is that they are steadily decreasing pathways to citizenship. So, for example, the ending of TPS. And TPS is a provision under which the government protects people from deportation from certain countries afflicted by natural disasters, war, and dangerous conditions. So we've seen TPS for the Haitians, for Venezuelans, Afghans, Cameroonians, Hondurans, Nicaraguans. That is no longer an avenue for people. So you've gone, you've basically taken people that have come to this country because of a certain process and because, frankly, a certain promise by this country. And then um, deny them that pathway, even though they've, again, gone through the steps and really been following um, everything outlined under that program. And we've seen this across the board, and we've also seen this, the unfortunate um, situation, what's happening with individual on student visas, right? Everybody in this country should be afforded First Amendment rights, but because of certain viewpoints of this administration, particularly those students that are in support of Palestinian rights, have been, denied their legal status. They've been denied visas. Even those with green cards have been arrested, detained, and deported. And I think that is um, really the travesty of what's happening now, but it also speaks to fundamentally different ideologies and viewpoints on what this country is founded on and what our relationship with immigrants should be. And I think that is something that, we are really wrestling right now with as a country. But it sounds like this is not the first time that we've wrestled with this, and might not be the last. Yeah. And I just want to also ask you, how do race and class intersect in shaping Sikh American immigration experiences?
Yeah, I so for that, I think in terms of kind of race and class, I'd like to kind of emphasize, I think, the approach that we can take in trying to understand these experiences. We talked about a lot in this conversation so far, and we've talked about experiences that link, in terms of Sikh identity, racial identity, in terms of immigration status, in terms of labor, all of these sort of different categories that are obviously intersecting to inform some kind of unique experience, right, for people. And so, in terms of race and class, what we've seen in the past is there's a lot of policies that don't specifically just focus on a race or a class or a religion, but it's often correlated with a class as well, or with race as well, and kind of put together. For instance, one of the first policies to restrict immigration, like I said, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, targets Chinese individuals who are coming over with the intention of laboring in this country. But we see that happen as again with the sort of the annulment of the gentleman's agreement with Japan and the US, right? That there's a similar sort of blockade on Japanese immigration for those that come here with the intention of laboring. What we're kind of seeing now is that labor becomes a sort of centerpiece to kind of talk about restriction, right? We have, in terms of the HB1 visa, right, and South Asians, right, like that's very huge. It's not just about immigration restriction, but class and labor becomes a platform through which to get there, right? We see that with the rhetoric around truckers as well, right? Of those that are in other laboring communities to kind of like use that as a jumping board to stop immigration or slow it down, right? That labor is often used that way. So for my approach, I think it's important to always take an intersectional approach, to always think about race and class and religion and all of these things together, because I think it just gives us a better insight into what's going on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm just looking at the time. I do want to get to the question. So, I just want to, the first question, and thank you all for your questions in the chat. So, Amrit, this is for you. How did your parents decide to go to El Centro area? Did they have any relatives who settled there? Um, the Pioneer Museum has family histories, and the info there seemed to have become a memorial as future immigration from Punjab was not continuing anymore. That area was not having jobs or opportunities anymore.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. And shout out for also knowing about the Pioneering Museum. I've been there many times, and it's a very sort of interesting stop in history, right? But my father first came to the Imperial Valley. He was a farmer in that region, very, very keen in farming. And so for us, it seemed like a very obvious place to go. He had a lot of networks within the area. There's not a lot of families there, even to this day, but they're very close knit. They're very closely associated with one another, and so my dad, who had close ties to some of the families there, that was kind of his immediate spot to go into. And so we're still very close with a lot of the folks there, and there's a very it's a small but very vibrant Punjabi community. In terms of more recent arrivals, we don't see a lot of new settlement within that area, like you said, of course, because of jobs and opportunities not really existing for first and even second and third generations. So people have kind of shifted out of that space. But there's a lot of folks that are coming in who are South Asian and particularly Sikh Punjabi as well, who are detained at the ICE center in Calexico, California. And so they do come and stop at the local Gurdwara. And there is a history and legacy of folks supporting new immigrants that are passing through, right? So it's still a very unique space and a still very important space, I think, in Sikh Punjabi history and in the current period as well.
Awesome, thank you. And I think another question about California and Sikh American history is, can you please explain why the Stockton Gurdwara is an inspiration to us? Is the question.
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. Just as a space, I think, where people were able to kind of bond together and create a very solidified space in society where Sikh people, Punjabi people, South Asian people more broadly can meet and congregate. I think it's important to also consider the time where folks were not having a lot of opportunity to kind of be able to settle together. So the Gurdwara offered a space of refuge, a space of community, a space of faith for folks that were both in the Sikh community and even outside of it, right? They also helped institute, support systems and networks for folks that were coming through. So I think they thought more broadly about how to support the community. So faith was a big factor, but also it was a real good example of creating Sangat and the power of that, right? Of people being able to come together and support one another. So I think there's definitely a past that could be inspirational to us today.
Awesome. I agree. I think it is absolutely inspirational, particularly with what's happening today. Um, another question here is asking you to talk a little bit about the Punjabi Mexican history, and specifically, what are the sources where we can get more details and information on this interesting history?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There is a very vibrant Punjabi Mexican history in the Imperial Valley and even in other spaces like Yuba City as well, which leads to sort of the second generation and people going through birthright citizenship to own land and settle and build communities and families. Karen Leonard is a very prominent scholar of the borderlands and also Punjabi Mexican families. There's also documentaries and films as well that have kind of talked about this and interviewed. Karen Leonard has left her archive at Stanford. So if folks are kind of in the Bay Area, that's a great place to kind of check that out as well. In kind of navigating how we can learn more about a very unique community. But if you go down to Imperial Valley, the Gurdwara, actually, the Sikh temple in El Centro, is this like hub of knowledge and information on these networks too, right? Where people can kind of point you to people that if you wanted to chat with folks or interview folks, and they'd be happy to kind of have these conversations. But there are sources and details out there. They're not as common, but they are. It's a very interesting past to dive into for sure.
Awesome. There is another question. I guess maybe it's for both of us since you're also from the Bay. It's for me and for you. This is about Harmeet Dillon, whether she's going to help Sikh oppose anti-immigrant tendency of I guess, the Trump administration and supporters. Um, and yeah, I would say it's really, for me, would be hard to say. She does have her position in DOJ, which does not directly oversee activities, like ICE, which are under DHS or CBP. My hope is that she would use her platform to speak out against the excesses that we've seen, particularly with ICE immigration enforcement, and where they are doing things outside the law. But um, I I'm not sure I can answer that question on her behalf. I don't know, Amrita, if you have anything to add there.
I agree. I think it's hard to say because she's also, you know, it's interesting because she is in a position of power, and so she can obviously speak to support Sikhs in the US and what they're going through. And so to choose or not to choose to do that is obviously her own political stance and social stance that she's taking. It's hard to kind of gauge what way she wouldn't show support. But I think there's ample opportunity for her to show support if she wanted to.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I just want to make sure I've got. There was a question. Bhagat Singh was in California. That was a question.
Oh, the Bhagat Singh Thind. Yeah. So there's the Bhagat Singh, the revolutionary in Punjab, who's quite big. This is Bhagat Singh Thind, which is very interesting as well. When you go through older records of Punjabi Sikh immigrants, actually, there is not a lot of name diversity. So unfortunately, sometimes we do kind of have this like overlap that happens. But the Bhagat Singh that I'm talking about is Bhagat Singh Thind in the US, who was an original member of the Gadar Party, ended up being one of the early Sikh people to join the US military with a turban and beard and fight in World War I to come back to apply for citizenship and to be denied. And so he's part of that legacy. Both Bhagat Singhs are obviously very important, but on two different parts of the world.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for that clarification. And I think we're almost at time. So I just we've talked about a lot of very heavy stuff through the course of of this hour. And I just wanted to sort of turn it over to you, Amrit. Are there any lessons we can draw upon from the past to really help us, ground us in this moment and think about um how we can push back and push through where we are now currently, particularly in regards to immigration?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I appreciate that we're ending hopefully on a positive note. A lot of the diving into the past can be a little bit daunting and heavy, and so this is nice to kind of, I think, anticipate something more to find possibility in all of this precarity, I guess. And one of the things that I often turn back to is that there's a level of comfort also in understanding that our community has been through a lot of these trials and these sort of barriers to access of political, social, economic rights in the past. And they've been deeply impacted by discriminatory policies and conditions. And there's ways that they have still managed to pull together to fight through, to create a network amongst each other, to create a network with other communities. I think this is a call for us to be able to create solidarity efforts with other communities that are going through something quite similar, right? What are other communities doing to support each other? How can we kind of partake in that as well so that they stand by our side when something happens to us? What are ways that we can deep dive in our own community and be more active in our local sanghats, right? How can we kind of create spaces where our youth are understanding what the world is like and how do we prepare them well for that? And also, how do we kind of make sure that people in our community who may be more recent arrivals are knowing of what their rights are, right? So I guess my understanding is to show up, but I'm
Yes.
curious to hear what you think, Kiran, about the same question.
I would wholeheartedly agree. And as you were talking, I was just thinking not as a full plug for SALDEF, but in terms of a lot of what you shared in terms of empowerment and really finding our agency. I would encourage folks to think about whether it's SALDEF or, Sikh orgs that are really dealing with this work, whether it's, supporting detainees, whether it's sharing Know Your Rights resources, whether it's building young Sikh leaders, whether it's involvement in your local communities. There's some wonderful interfaith initiatives right now supporting and providing community safety. So there is ample opportunity to get involved. I'm obviously biased. I would love for y'all to come to SALDEF and to really participate in our programs and initiatives which are national, and you really advance the work both on the policy level, really on the ground work with immigration detention facilities, again, with the education, both internally for our community with Know Your Rights and externally, because I think there's still a lot of mis and disinformation about our community. And that's part of changing the narrative and having people build understanding and build that dialogue. So yeah, I hope we can all really find our agency during this time and not let the fear and uncertainty of the moment limit us from doing what is possible. Um, and with that, I just want to take a moment because I didn't do it at the start of this webinar, but Amrit very kindly did it for me. Thank Sikh Foundation for giving us the space for this conversation. I think it's a really important one, and I really appreciate Amrit your perspectives, historical perspectives. For me, really, I'm dealing with this, and I'm doing the work on a day to day, but really zooming up and understanding that this is we've been here before as a community and we can get through this.
Thank you, Kiran, for the conversation, for being my partner in this. Thank you for Sikh Foundation again for bringing us together. And thank you to everyone who took time out of their Friday to join us in this conversation.
Thank you. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa,
Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.